In a seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood, a family is torn apart by betrayal, lust, and lies. What began as a strained mother-daughter relationship spirals into a deadly secret affair, leading to a shocking murder that will leave everyone wondering, who can you truly trust when those closest to you carry the darkest secrets? This is the story of a stepfather, a daughter, and the deadly consequences of their twisted relationship. Daniel grew up in a small town in Texas, born in 1970 to a hard-working family. His father was a mechanic, and his mother ran a small diner that barely made ends meet. From a young age, Daniel dreamed of a life beyond the dusty roads and endless days working in his father's garage. He wanted more than just fixing cars and barely scraping by. In high school, he told his parents that he wanted to build homes, to create something lasting. They were supportive, but cautious, warning him about the struggles of starting a business in construction. By 1995, Daniel had moved to Houston with the goal of starting his own contracting business. He worked tirelessly, often pulling 16-hour days just to make ends meet. His dream was to build homes, not just to make money, but to create places where families could grow, places that would stand for generations. Despite his ambitions, Daniel remained grounded in his values, always remembering the simplicity of the life he left behind. In 2003, Daniel married Laura. He thought he had found everything he had ever wanted: a stable business, a loving wife, and the chance to finally start a family of his own. But the pressure of his work, combined with the growing tension in his marriage, began to weigh on him. Conversations with Laura became less about dreams and more about managing day-to-day struggles. Daniel felt the weight of his business, the long hours, and his failing relationship pressing down on him. By 2010, as his stepdaughter Emma entered adulthood, Daniel found himself torn between his loyalty to his family and the temptation of something new. He had once dreamed of building homes and creating stability, but his personal life had become a series of compromises and regrets. His story would soon take a dark turn, far from the life he had once envisioned. 4 years later, the family was thrown into turmoil when on March 6, 2014, the police were called to the house after a neighbor reported hearing screams. When they arrived, they found Daniel's lifeless body and Emma sitting in a daze, covered in blood. She offered no resistance when they took her into custody. Looking back, Emma's relationship with her mother, Laura, had always been complicated. By the time she turned 12 in 2005, her life changed drastically when Laura married Daniel. Emma had been used to having her mother's full attention, but Laura's marriage introduced a shift in priorities. Emma, already struggling with the transition into her teenage years, felt like an outsider in her own home. Laura was always striving for perfection, making sure their house was spotless, making sure her work was flawless, and expecting Emma to be the same. As the years passed, particularly by 2010, the tension between them grew. Laura had taken her interior design business to new heights, and her career consumed much of her energy. Emma, now a teenager, found herself lost in the shadows of her mother's success. The strict rules at home felt suffocating, and Laura's perfectionism only amplified Emma's feelings of inadequacy. It wasn't just the clean rooms and polished image that strained their relationship. It was the emotional distance. Emma needed validation, love, and attention, something her mother seemed too busy to provide. By the time Emma turned 18 in 2011, she was already starting to rebel. She stayed out late, got involved in relationships her mother disapproved of, and sought attention wherever she could find it. The more Laura tried to control her, the more Emma pushed back. Emma's father had left when she was just a baby, And although Daniel had been a stable figure in her life for years, their relationship began to evolve into something more complex. Daniel had always tried to mediate between the two. He watched the arguments between Emma and Laura escalate, always trying to calm things down, always being the one to listen when Emma vented her frustrations. Over time, Emma began to see Daniel in a different light, not just as her stepfather, but as someone who understood her in a way her mother never did. He was kind, patient, and always willing to hear her side. In late 2013, Emma, now 20, decided to act on her growing feelings toward Daniel. The affair started gradually. At first, it was harmless flirting, moments where Emma pushed boundaries to see how far she could go. Daniel dismissed it initially, seeing it as playful. But Emma knew what she was doing. She was clever, manipulative even, sensing that Daniel was vulnerable in his troubled marriage. Laura had become more distant, focusing entirely on her career, leaving Daniel feeling unappreciated and lonely. Emma seized the opportunity. By September 2013, things escalated. Emma made it clear that her feelings were no longer just a game, and Daniel, torn between guilt and the allure of something forbidden, finally gave in. Emma had the power now, a sense of control over both her mother and Daniel. To her, the affair was more than just physical. It was revenge. It was her way of getting back at Laura for all the years of neglect, for making her feel invisible and unwanted. For Daniel, the affair was a mix of guilt and desire. He knew what they were doing was wrong. But after years of emotional strain in his marriage, he found comfort in Emma's attention. The two carried on their secret, meeting behind Laura's back, always careful to hide the truth. Emma would sneak into his room late at night, or they would find excuses to be alone in the house. Their conversations during these moments were filled with half-whispered regrets and justifications, but neither of them stopped. By December 2013, the affair had become their little secret. It was a dangerous game, but Emma thrived on the power she held. Every time she looked at her mother, she felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing she was keeping something so big from her. She loved seeing Daniel struggle between his guilt and his desire, knowing that she had the upper hand. But Emma's emotions were volatile. She wasn't just seeking revenge anymore. She had grown attached to Daniel. He became more than just a pawn in her plan to get back at her mother. She began to rely on him for the validation she had never received from Laura. However, that same attachment made her reckless, and the affair began to take its toll on Daniel. His guilt was mounting, and the risk of getting caught weighed heavily on him. But Emma, driven by a need for control, didn't care about the consequences. As they entered 2014, the affair started to unravel. Emma, no longer satisfied with keeping the secret, grew more confrontational with her mother. The tension in the house reached new heights, and Emma, always playing the victim, began to hint to her mother that Daniel wasn't the man she thought he was. The darkness that had been brewing for years was now fully out in the open, setting the stage for the tragic events to follow. Emma's manipulation would soon spiral into something much darker, and there would be no turning back. By early 2014, the once carefully hidden affair between Daniel and Emma began to spiral out of control. The guilt that had once quietly lingered in the background started to consume Emma. For months, she had thrived on the power she held over Daniel, relishing the manipulation and secrecy. But over time, the burden of her actions began to weigh on her. The affair was no longer a twisted game. It had become an emotional prison from which she couldn't escape. Emma had always been someone who craved attention and control, and for a while, she had both from Daniel. The secrecy, however, began to take its toll. She grew more reckless, less cautious, and more emotional. The strain of keeping up the lie was making her volatile. She started lashing out at both Daniel and her mother, Laura, acting out in ways that hinted something deeper was wrong. But Laura, preoccupied with her career and maintaining the facade of a perfect family, didn't catch the signs. She saw Emma's increasing irritability as nothing more than a rebellious phase, never imagining that her husband could be at the center of the turmoil. In February 2014, the cracks in Emma's control became visible. She was suffocating under the weight of her guilt, feeling trapped by the affairs she had orchestrated. Her once calculated manipulations turned into impulsive decisions. She wanted to end the secret, but the fear of facing the consequences paralyzed her. The emotional pressure grew, and Emma became more aggressive, picking fights with both Daniel and her mother. Each confrontation with Daniel became a reminder of what they had done, and every moment of silence felt like another lie hanging over her head. The guilt was a constant presence, slowly eroding her confidence. The breaking point came in March 2014. Emma, cornered by her emotions and desperate for release, made a decision that would change everything. In a moment of emotional desperation, she went to her mother, Laura, and told her that Daniel had forced himself on her. The lie slipped out easily, and in Emma's mind, this was her escape. A way to shift the blame, to put the responsibility on Daniel, and to free herself from the suffocating secrecy of their relationship. Laura, who had already begun to harbor doubts about her marriage, was devastated by Emma's claim. The years of tension between mother and daughter melted away in an instant, replaced by a fierce protectiveness over her child. Laura believed Emma without question. She had seen the signs of something wrong, but never suspected this. Now, with this revelation, everything seemed to make sense. She was horrified, not just by what Emma had told her, but by the idea that her husband could betray her in such a way. On March 6, 2014, Laura confronted Daniel. The atmosphere in the house was tense and volatile. The confrontation was explosive, as Laura, fueled by rage and a sense of betrayal, threatened to ruin Daniel. She vowed to expose him, telling him that his reputation in the community would be destroyed. For Laura, there was no room for doubt. Her daughter's story had shaken her to her core, and she was determined to make Daniel pay for what she believed he had done. Daniel, shocked and desperate, pleaded his innocence, but Laura was having none of it. She packed her bags and moved out, leaving Daniel in the house, contemplating the fallout. The days that followed Laura's departure were filled with unbearable tension for Daniel. Every hour that passed without resolving the situation felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, and the weight of Emma's lie hung over him like a dark cloud. The accusation had not only destroyed his marriage, but threatened to ruin his life. By March 8, 2014, Daniel reached his breaking point. He knew he had to confront Emma. The truth had to come out. That morning, the house was quiet. Daniel paced the living room, gathering the courage to face Emma. When he finally confronted her, his voice was low but firm. He begged her to tell the truth, to explain why she had created such a devastating lie that had torn everything apart. Emma, standing tall with an air of defiance, refused to back down at first. She crossed her arms and looked away, her eyes betraying a flicker of guilt. But Daniel, desperate and broken, pressed on. His desperation began to wear her down. The weight of her lie was too heavy for Emma to carry any longer. Her facade cracked and her defiance crumbled. She broke down in tears, admitting that she had lied to her mother. It wasn't out of malice, but rather a twisted attempt to gain control over her life and escape the mess she had created. Her emotions, tangled and confused, led her to the lie that set everything in motion. Daniel, while shocked and devastated by her admission, saw an opportunity. He knew this was his chance to clear his name. Unbeknownst to Emma, Daniel had been recording the entire conversation on his phone. Every word of her confession was now saved, a lifeline that would help him restore the truth and potentially bring Laura back. He felt a sense of victory rising within him, though it was bittersweet. He thought this would finally end Emma's manipulation. Emma watched as Daniel's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the desperate man pleading for his innocence. He was in control now, and he made it clear to her that her game was over. Daniel told her that he planned to take the recording to Laura and expose her lie. Emma, hearing those words, felt the walls closing in around her. Panic quickly turned to fear, and fear morphed into rage. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't allow herself to be humiliated, to have her life destroyed by her own actions. The shame, guilt, and overwhelming fear of what would come next clouded her judgment. In a moment of pure, uncontrollable anger, Emma acted without thinking. She stormed into the kitchen, and her eyes locked onto a knife sitting on the counter. Without hesitation, she grabbed it. Her body moved on its own, driven by emotions she couldn't control. She charged at Daniel, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. Before he could react, Emma stabbed him, once, twice, and then again. The force of her rage translated into each thrust of the knife, and blood splattered across the room. The brutality of the attack left Daniel gasping for air, his body collapsing to the floor. The knife slipped from Emma's hand as she stood over him, frozen in shock. The kitchen, which had once been the heart of their home, was now stained with the blood of betrayal. The sound of Daniel's body hitting the cold tiles echoed in the silence, and the reality of what she had done slowly sank in. The house fell into an eerie stillness. Emma stood motionless, her hands trembling, her eyes wide as she looked at the lifeless body of Daniel crumpled on the floor. The kitchen knife lay beside him, the once bright blade now slick with blood. The room, which had been filled with rage moments earlier, was now overtaken by silence. Emma's breath was shallow, her mind racing as she tried to process the gravity of what had just happened. For a moment, she couldn't move. Time seemed to stretch, and she was paralyzed by the horror of what she had done. Blood pooled around Daniel's body, seeping into the cracks of the kitchen floor. She stared down at her hands, still stained with the evidence of her crime. Her heart raced as she considered her next move, but deep down, she knew it was too late. There was no escape. The evidence was everywhere. Her fingerprints on the knife, the blood on her clothes, and the damning recording on Daniel's phone. On March 8, 2014, the neighbor next door, startled by the sound of a scream, called the police. It wasn't long before they arrived. When the officers entered the house, they found Emma sitting in a daze, covered in Daniel's blood. The scene was grim. The once clean kitchen, now a horrifying tableau of violence. Daniel's body lay still, the red stains on the floor, telling the tragic story of what had unfolded. Emma offered no resistance. She was too numb, too overwhelmed by the weight of her actions. The officers quickly took her into custody, and, as they led her out of the house, the neighborhood that had once seemed so peaceful was now the site of a terrible crime. The investigation began immediately. The police searched Daniel's phone and uncovered the recording of Emma's confession, which provided a clearer picture of what had transpired in the days leading up to the murder. Detectives pieced together the sequence of events: the affair, the lies, the confrontation, and ultimately, the moment of uncontrollable rage that ended Daniel's life. By March 10th, 2014, detectives began questioning Emma. She admitted to the affair during her interrogation, but initially she tried to claim self-defense. She told investigators that Daniel had cornered her, and in her panic, she acted to protect herself. However, the evidence painted a different story. The recorded confession, combined with the brutal nature of the attack, suggested that this was a crime fueled by emotion, not self-preservation. Detectives also interviewed Laura, who was devastated by the news. The revelation of Emma's lies shattered her. She had believed Emma's story without question, and now she had to face the reality that her daughter had not only manipulated her, but had also killed the man she once called her husband. The fallout was overwhelming, and Laura was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. On March 20th, 2014, after gathering enough evidence, detectives charged Emma with second-degree murder. The town was left in shock. The seemingly perfect family had been hiding dark secrets that no one could have imagined. What appeared to be a simple case of domestic tension had turned into a chilling tale of lies, manipulation, and murder. The truth about the affair, the deception, and the violent end left everyone questioning how such a tragedy could have unfolded so quietly behind closed doors. Emma's trial began on July 15, 2014. The courtroom was packed with locals and media, all eager to witness the unraveling of the tragic story. Emma, now 21, sat quietly throughout the proceedings, her once rebellious demeanor replaced by an eerie calmness. The prosecution laid out the facts: the affair, the manipulation, and the brutal murder. The recording of Emma's confession played a pivotal role in the case, painting her as a young woman who had spiraled out of control, driven by guilt and rage. The defense attempted to paint Emma as a victim of emotional instability, arguing that her actions were not premeditated. They suggested that the intense pressure from her relationship with her mother and the affair with Daniel had clouded her judgment, leading to the tragic outcome. However, the evidence was overwhelming. The physical evidence, combined with the recording and witness testimonies, left little room for doubt. By August 10, 2014, the jury returned with their verdict. Emma was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison. As the verdict was read, Emma remained expressionless, seemingly resigned to her fate. Laura, who had attended every day of the trial, sat in the back of the courtroom, her face marked by grief and disbelief. She had lost both her husband and her daughter in the most unimaginable way. After the trial, the town slowly returned to its normal routine, but the shadow of the tragedy lingered. Emma's story was one that would be remembered for years, an affair that spiraled into violence, leaving a family shattered. The home where the events unfolded stood as a silent reminder of the lives torn apart by lies and betrayal. Laura, devastated by the loss of her family, left the town by the end of 2014, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. She sought solace elsewhere, far from the memories that haunted her. Emma's name became a whisper in the town's history, a cautionary tale of what could happen when secrets fester and emotions spiral out of control. In the end, the story was a chilling reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly a seemingly perfect family could unravel under the weight of lies, guilt, and revenge. Emma's life would continue behind bars, while the town moved on, forever marked by the tragedy. And who would you even blame for this sort of thing? It's not easy to point fingers, but we have various other cases where the real villain was presented clearly to us, like the case where a housewife affair